Other than the vast geological forces which thrust the great granite stacks through the earth, buckled the hills and carved the valleys, there can be few processes which have shaped Dartmoor's landscape more than tin mining. As a Dartmoor adventurer, it's something you just take for granted. What's that weird mound? A heap of waste from tin mining. What are those ruins all about? Tin miners' huts. Why is this valley such a mess? Tin miners. That little stream doesn't look natural. Tin mining. But at some point I started wondering what actually is tin. Why were the people of the past so mad about it? And could I get my hands on a piece? Welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. The first written record of tin mining on Dartmoor comes from the 12th century. But Dartmoor's tin mining probably goes much, much further back than that, as it's a rare and important ingredient in the making of bronze, the metal which changed the course of world history back in the Bronze Age around 2000 BC. And there's a particularly exciting theory about this, uncovered by Pete Chesborough, with whom I discussed this idea earlier in the year. Give it a watch. Go on, click on the thingy. It's up there in the top right corner. It's okay, we'll wait for you. Enjoy it? Good. Now back to the 12th century. The people of medieval Britain, indeed Europe, needed tin for all sorts of things. It was the key ingredient in pewter, which was the go-to material for plates, tankards, buttons, candlesticks, cutlery, and just about any other household item you can think of. Sadly, one of the metals that was added to tin to make pewter was lead, so you can see why the use of pewters died out, along with all those who ate off it. Still, before we realised lead's toxicity, pewter was in incredibly high demand, and as I've already mentioned, tin is actually quite a scarce commodity, meaning that rather than the barren and empty Dartmoor we now love, the Dartmoor of the past was, at least in places, bustling with industry as the tinners sought their fortune in extracting this rare metal. So, how was it gathered? This little gem of a book has the answers. One of the strangest features of tin, from a mining perspective, is that the best quality material is found near the surface. So, although some later workings use shafts and pits, the majority of tin workings involve scouring the surface of the land and generally wrecking the place in a process called tin streaming, which uses one of Dartmoor's other huge natural resources, water. Tinners would churn up a hillside using picks, then pour water down it by redirecting a stream or building a leat so that the light surface soil would wash away, leaving the heavier cassiterite, the ore containing tin, to be shoveled up and harvested. Entire valleys were, over the course of centuries, turned upside down, inside out and every which way in the search for this material, leaving the lumpy messes we now see all over the moor. So great an industry was tin mining on Dartmoor that it even required its own parliament and laws, the Stanary Courts, who kept the industry regulated and met at a roughly central point, Crocken Tor, to meet and debate. And by about 1500, when the tinning industry reached its peak, so much waste material was being poured into the rivers that several harbours silted up, causing the Stanary Court to pass a law demanding the miners dump their waste material onto dry ground instead. And the industry didn't stop with the extraction. Rather than transport the raw cassiterite to be processed elsewhere, the tin would actually be smelted in situ before being transported as tin ingots to wherever it was needed. This meant the building of blowing houses, whose remains can be found all over the moor today. Here the cassiterite was ground up, then blasted in a furnace and poured into moulds. And this process is what interested me the most, I think. I'd got into my head that I wanted to attempt this for myself and hold in my hand a nugget of Dartmoor tin that I had personally extracted and smelted. But even with all this information, I still didn't feel confident that I'd be able to create my own tin. how would I identify the correct material to process? Was it as simple as grinding up Dartmoor dirt and getting it really, really hot? And would I even be able to build a fire hot enough? What I needed was more help. What I needed was someone with a combination of geeky knowledge, a scientific mind, and borderline pyromaniac tendencies. That's right, a chemistry teacher. And luckily, one of my best buddies in the entire world happens to be one. So, earlier in the year, on a hot summer's day, Ken and I headed out to Dartmoor to see if I could extract some cassiterite by panning a river, and better still, if I could extract the necessary knowledge to smelt it from his scientific brain. Welcome to the Dartmoor podcast.
Is it really a podcast?
Yeah, kind of right there. Right, I've been watching some YouTube videos of like old guys with beards sort of panning rivers and things, some techniques. So I think that's the basis behind it, isn't it? If we're getting stuff like up in the water and the heavy stuff's going to sink down to the bottom. And the reason we can pan it is because it's heavier than sand. Is sand a chemical? What's sand?
So sand, most of sand is silicon dioxide.
Right.
So cassiterite ore that sort of tin is mostly found in sort of around Cornwall and other sort of granite outcrops like Dartmoor contains tin and is relatively dense as an ore. So it's got other metals in it as well as sulfur. Most of the metals from the bottom of the periodic table are all made of large ions or atoms, and therefore they're denser and heavier and more packed together.
So I'm imagining we're going to find little flakes of blackish coloured, sort of like sand. It will sort of look like, but it will be in the bottom of the pan, showing it was heavier. That's my theory. Anyway.
Yeah, because a lot of sand are black little bits as well, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's going to be quite difficult to identify positively, other than the fact that the difference in density might mean that, it shows up differently in the pan. I don't think we'll definitely know until we try to process it into something later on. So
that's good. That's going to be, even if we do find it, that's where things get complicated, right? So especially if what we've got's not even tin. But we're going to but presumably at that stage we've got a load of stuff that full easily, right?
Okay.
And let's say some of it's not tin. Is just the idea that we heat the whole thing up and it would all separate into tin and not tin, or is it going to be a bit more complicated than that?
Well, I think we're gonna have to do a few processes to it in order to separate it. So we're definitely going to have to, looking at the way that sort of ancient people did it, we're definitely going to have to roast it to try to drive off certain impurities, so things like sulfides and so on, and then sort of leach it through with water, sulfuric acid. These would have been sort of ways of removing some of the more soluble components, and hopefully we're going to be left with some metals. If it's a cassiterite or something similar that might contain some iron, that even if we don't remove all of the silicate rock, that when it gets hot enough, then this should form what's called in sort of smelting terms slag, which can be sort of scooped off. So there might be a crust of iron silicate slag, so hopefully the majority of the other metals and impurities would have been removed at that time. So that's going to be as close to pure tin as I think we're going to be able to get.
So you reckon like a bit of iron getting in the way could be a problem as well?
I don't necessarily think it'd be a problem, because in the old days... Oh no, in the old days they would have added iron oxide to it as something called flux.
Right, okay.
Which just allows some of the oxygen and the silicon to actually stick to the iron, and like I say, form this slag that can be removed. So I think some of the impurities might be helpful when it comes to the removal process.
So but the smelting process back then must have been quite, we sort of think of it as maybe being primitive, but it wouldn't have been at all, would it? It would have been quite a difficult thing to actually do, to get a fire that heat and that. duration?
I think so. I think sort of the very early days, it might well have just been pure luck.
Yeah.
You might have built a very large fire for a sort of celebration, larger than normal, therefore got hotter than normal, and you wanted to make it look fancy and have it lined with sort of, rock sides and so on. And at the end of it, there's a pellet of this semi-shiny stuff.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the whitey coloured metal, that would be tin, or the sort of reddish metal, maybe copper, and that would have perhaps given the initial idea. But then when it comes to even smelting in ancient Egypt, 3000 BCE,
Yeah.
then they would have had to have special pits that they would have had to use bellows for, to try to really force oxygen in there. They would have known that having sort of certain grades of coke or charcoal would have given them the hottest fires. And actually they wouldn't have known about the chemistry, because it's the carbon in the charcoal that's taking the oxygen and coming out as carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. But actually that's the really important part, because that's what's taking the oxygen away from the tin oxide to leave just the tin behind. So they would have just known it needs to be really, really hot. But I suppose
and then they were sort of locking in on that it had this extra effect as well with
this extra reducing agent. That's how they got their fire burning, but it was also what was taking the oxygen away from the metal.
That sounds like a lot of hard work if we've got to dig a pit, make a really powerful fire and pump bellows through it. Is there a sort of cheat modern way we could try and make our tin into...
There is a way that
like cassiterite into tin.
I've been thinking about doing. I've never tried it with tin, so I have tried it with iron oxide and been successful multiple times when trying this to give us pellets of pure iron, and that's using a thermite reaction.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. That sounds like...
So thermite is pretty cool. You might have seen it on Breaking Bad, them using it to melt the lock to get into the warehouse and so on. The special forces also use it as well for the same sort of reasons. If they want to sort of melt a lock and get into a door quite quietly, it requires a couple of relatively easy to source chemicals. So normally you would use your iron oxide and some aluminium. So the idea is you always want something more reactive than your metal in the reactivity series. So carbon is more reactive than tin, therefore it will take the oxygen away from it. So we want to use something very, very much more reactive than tin or iron, and that's going to be aluminium.
Okay.
So aluminium doesn't sound very interesting because you make drinks cans out of it, and you tend to think of it as being quite unreactive. It doesn't react with your Coca-Cola, but actually it's already reacted with oxygen. So your drinks can is actually aluminium oxide, so on the outside. So aluminium is extremely reactive, and aluminium, as long as you get it hot enough, should be able to take all of the oxygen away from our tin oxide, just leave us with tin, in a very impressive fireworks display of heat. It will destroy any crucible or anything like that we try to do it in. It will have to be done in a fume cupboard, in a sort of a special pit of sands that we tend to use for these types of things. It can be quite difficult to get to ignite sometimes, so I've got my own special ignition mixture, which I'm not going to tell you what's in because I don't want any comments of should this person be using these chemicals and so on, but if I add my special ignition mixture and it's dry enough and the sort of the quantities and ratios are right, we should be able to get it to work. If it works with iron oxide, I can't see why it wouldn't work with tin oxide.
Brilliant. That sounds really exciting and much more fun than slaving away in the woods for hours trying to...
Less exhausting, definitely.
Yeah, that'd be great. Is there anything we've not talked about which we could do?
I don't think so, other than this lovely view.
Yeah, it's bloody amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
That's right, mate, it's brilliant.
I'm looking forward to getting in that river now and cooling off.
Yeah, me too, actually. Let's turn off the camera. Oh, my legs seem to slip. A paddle in the cold river was just what we needed to cool down, and with a bit of practice we got the hang of the panning process. Scoop up a load of sand and get shuffling it about. The general idea is to get the sand up into suspension, then carefully tip some water out. In theory, the lighter material will pour away, while the heavier elements, like cassiterite, will remain in the bottom of the pan. An afternoon of paddling later, and we had a rather underwhelming quantity of black sand, which I felt pretty sure contained cassiterite. Ken was less sure, but we decided to blow it up anyway. To the lab. If what we had did indeed contain tin, the first step would be to grind it up as small as possible so we could increase the surface area. Then we needed to get rid of as many impurities as possible. Of course, this involved playing with a Bunsen burner.
Ooh, I told you it might fizz.
Then using unnecessarily fancy looking equipment like this thingy to rinse our black sand in acid, then filtered water. The dirty liquid left over from this process implies that we had at least removed some unwanted muck from our sample. Next, we needed to drive off any excess moisture, which meant more flames. And finally, to the fun bit. Now, Ken was so sure this wasn't going to work that he decided to first demonstrate the process with some iron oxide instead of our putative tin oxide. Here, the red powder of the ground-up iron oxide is given the thermite treatment. As Paz Ken explained back in the summer, the heat kicks things off, but it's the highly reactive aluminium in the mix that's removing the oxygen from the less reactive iron oxide. And what's iron oxide without the oxide? Iron, seen here as these lumps that have welded themselves rather firmly to the bottom of the crucible. Would the tin work the same? In theory it should, but then it's hard to say if what we had much of a tin content. Let's see. So much for my lovely tin bead I was looking forward to showing you.
Might have just been my mixture, might have just been my ignition.
It just fizzles.
Never mind. Ken wasn't ready to give up yet, and in the true spirit of experimentation, wondered what would happen if we mixed iron and tin together. And why not? And the result was interesting. It burned much longer with a different coloured flame and produced a load of odd, brittle, vaguely metallic material.
This is definitely very different, George, from what we've seen previously. A lot longer. So that is molten metal that we've got at the end of that. A hell of a lot more than we had earlier.
I'm sure this is some sort of great discovery and we'll be gathering our Nobel Prize in no time. Just once Ken works out what it is we actually made.
Technical tool, use the end of a lighter to smash a pan of unknown origin.
Anyway, if I'm looking on the bright side, it means my tin smelting adventure isn't over. I'm sure I'll return to it in the future and maybe try out a different method. Feel free to leave your ideas below. And all that's left is to show some footage of me stomping around an old streamed valley at dusk in what I thought was going to be some sort of metaphor for the sun setting on Dartmoor's tin industry. It's strange to think of this deserted landscape of scattered ruins as being an important hub of industry, and it must have been a tough life out here for the tin miners of centuries past. Far from a nice paddle in a summer stream and then a fancy firework display in the lab, these guys were out here under the elements all year, digging and scouring, wading in the icy streams and lugging great dirty piles of cassiterite around. And as I've now learnt, the smelting of this metal isn't all that easy either. A great deal of ingenuity must have gone into the building of furnaces, crushing machines and moulds. Don't underestimate those old tinners. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.